We will move on to our next Trends panel. And I'm honored to introduce our panel moderator today, Eric Gertler, co-chairman and co-publisher of the New York Daily News and co-chairman of U.S. News and World Report. And Eric is going to make his way up to the stage. Eventually. He'll come up. The rest of the panelists, please make your way up. Before he took on these key roles, Eric was Executive Vice President of the New York City Economic Development Corporation and also Managing Director of the Center for Economic Transformation under Mayor Bloomberg and de Blasio. He oversaw more than 100 initiatives to promote economic development and job growth. Previously, he led a number of media and technology firms and is also a published author, among many other accomplishments shown in his bio. I will also introduce the rest of the panel. Hi.
Hello.
Jennifer Ryan Crozier. Hi. Jennifer Ryan Crozier is Vice President of IBM Corporate Citizenship and President of IBM's International Foundation. She leads IBM's global philanthropic and corporate citizenship efforts to help solve the most difficult societal challenges and pioneered their pro bono service program. Welcome. Timothy McClyman, welcome. Senior Vice President of Corporate Social Responsibility at American Express and President of the American Express Foundation. Tim leads his company's CSR and philanthropic efforts across the world, writes a notable blog about corporate responsibility issues, and is a former member of our very own BBB Foundation Board of Directors. Keith Maestrich, President and CEO of Amalgamated Bank. This bank, established to serve working people and connected to labor unions throughout its history, has recently become a B Corporation. Keith brings decades of experience in banking and labor issues, having previously been CFO and Deputy Chief of Staff for the SEIU. Welcome. Catherine Wild, hello. President and CEO at Partnership for New York City, Catherine has led the city's partnership since 2001. As its CEO, and before that spent nearly 2 decades managing its economic development and affordable housing programs. Her work is focused on spurring business innovation and building a stronger New York. Our panel.
Great. Thank you, Claire. And as Claire said, I'm Eric Gertler, and I have the privilege of being your moderator for today's discussion. And as she has already done introductions, you can tell we have a great panel, but we also have an important topic to get to today. I just want to frame the conversation very briefly. Corporate social responsibility is a term that's now being increasingly used and deployed. But as I'm sure in all of your different institutions, it means different things to different organizations and to different stakeholders with divergent expectations and different goals. So that is something that we're certainly going to explore. And also in recent times we've seen that in today's ever-changing world, in this globalized, more complicated world, the idea of social responsibilities was once viewed by some as sort of solely in the public sector or in charities, even though we've had a great tradition of charitable giving in this country going back to the days of Benjamin Franklin. But that monopoly no longer seems relevant anymore. Corporations are much more involved. They are leading the way in many ways, and that's also something that we want to get to. And I'm not interested in politicizing this conversation, but certainly in the last week we've seen some examples of corporations rising to the fore. With the Paris Accords, you've seen that in the absence of some governmental or global leadership, corporations are taking the lead. And why are they doing that now? Is that good business or good citizenship? And then the last thing that I want to get to, and I know it's on all your minds, it's a 5-letter word that starts with T, and it starts with TRU. And I think that's really important for us to talk about trust.
I thought you meant truth.
Right, that too. Could be truth too, but we're going to focus on trust. So, you know, that is clearly an important part of what companies are trying to do. So let's start this panel. I'd like to run this panel by the Queen's rules. By that, I don't refer to the Queen of England. I refer to the Queen's here in New York, which means we're New Yorkers. I want aggressive conversation. Let's keep it short. Let's cut everybody off. But in the words of Winston Churchill, don't interrupt me when I'm interrupting. I get some privileges of being the moderator. But so in any event, let's start with Kathy Wild, and notwithstanding that you've heard her bio, but beyond title, Kathy is someone that has a very deep understanding of the business climate here in New York, and is one who many CEOs in this city turn to because of the sound advice that she gives to everybody. And Kathy, can you set the table for us? Just give us your sort of macro view of what is going on with corporate social responsibility, and why has this suddenly become so important to companies?
Well, I think it's important to note that New York City has really been a center of corporate citizenship for many, many years. And I recently went to the service marking the passing of David Rockefeller at 101. And his family and many other corporate families of New York have for years taken civic responsibility. When the subway was first being built back at the beginning of the 1900s, the government for a change ran out of money at just the wrong moment, and it was J.P. Morgan and the bankers and the corporations that stepped in through the Chamber of Commerce and financed the initial subway system. So the history in New York, and I've talked to organizations, NGOs around the world, there is no city really that has the depth and breadth and historic commitment that New York has to business working in the interests of the city. So I think our model of corporate responsibility is more aggressive than most. What I've seen over the past, certainly since the financial crisis, the past decade, is that corporations began to recognize that they were really on their heels when it came to being proactive and in the public eye regarding their responsibility for community and civic activity. And I think there's been a real effort over the last decade to change that and to become more aggressive in very positive ways. And also for the first time, we've seen companies, as you referenced the Paris Accord comments, but leaders of public corporations speaking out on issues like immigration and immigration bans, like marriage equality, like gender-neutral bathrooms, which didn't happen historically. So there's a new dimension to corporate social responsibility, which, if you will, is weighing in on political issues more than we've ever seen before. And hopefully that's going to result in a better set of relationships with the public, stronger public understanding that employers are very much part of this community. And I think that's, people forget when they talk about corporations. Corporations, employers with more than 500 people in New York City employ 54%, provide 54% of the jobs. So much as everyone loves small business as growing the economy and a job provider, the majority of jobs in New York City are from big companies. So their engagement is really important.
Great, thank you, Kathy. Now I want to turn to Tim, and Tim has been a leading thinker in this area, not just for American Express, but also for AT&T, with a slight detour to the Second Stage Theater, but we're not going to get into that right now. But Tim, you're, as Kathy discussed, companies are taking a bigger role. American Express, is an important company here in New York City, taking a leading role in corporate social responsibility. Give us a sense of American Express's role in this realm of corporate social responsibility.
Thank you. Good morning. Well, as Kathy just mentioned, a lot of companies have a long history of being citizens here in New York City. We were founded as a company in 1850 in Lower Manhattan, and we've been in Lower Manhattan since then, and have really been, I think, good citizens pretty much since then. Our first grant was in 1862. Our first employee giving campaign was in 1885 when we helped raise money to build the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty when there wasn't any money to do that. So, I think that a lot of companies have corporate citizenship as part of their DNA, if you will, certainly part of our culture. And our employees are really engaged in that work. Everywhere from our CEO, down the chain, if you will, to all of our employees, whether they're in service centers around the world or here in corporate headquarters. So I think there's been an evolution, though, in the way that companies are engaged in their communities. We kind of started out as philanthropists, if you will, and a lot of that philanthropy was kind of spreading money out to a wide variety of causes and a wide variety of organizations. And we kind of morphed into volunteering and engaging our employees in communities. And from there, companies wanted to be more strategic with their giving and much more connected to their businesses or their business interests or business objectives. And then this whole idea of corporate social responsibility came to the forefront, which was really very much about what companies do rather than what they give or what they contribute to communities. But now all the talk is about purpose. We're grappling with that issue together with a lot of other companies. But there's certainly been an evolution in the field. There's been an evolution at American Express since 1850, and we'll see where that goes.
Right. Thank you, Tim. And now to Jen, who, prior to her current role at the foundation, held a number of senior positions at IBM in terms of communication, and she's responsible for thinking through. And one of the words when we had our conversation was engagement. And I wonder if you can talk about sort of the engagement strategy at IBM with respect to how you view corporate social responsibility.
Sure. Well, thank you. Good to be here. So, like American Express, IBM is a 105 younger company, but 105-year-old company with a very long tradition of engagement of our employees and also the way that we're engaging with the world. I think what's unique about IBM is really being at the forefront of innovation, right? So that's what we do for our clients, and therefore it's what we have to do for the world. And that has a couple of pieces to it. One is about taking our technology and our platform and thinking about how can those be useful for the world on some of the most pressing social issues. So whether that's education, environment, and health, we can talk about those, but really constantly challenging ourselves to say, how could this latest technology, this latest platform, this latest form of intelligence benefit the world in tough ways? The second piece, though, is also thinking about the flip side of that, which there's a lot of discussion on about artificial intelligence, and really thinking about what are the principles that are important to make sure that we're really going forward with our technology, whether it's in our commercial engagements or our policy engagements, in a very ethical way. So we issued in January at the World Economic Forum a series of principles on artificial intelligence that we see as being very important to guiding the future of that technology. And it has to do with transparency, it has to do with who owns the data, it has to do with how we use the data and being very forthcoming about the algorithms and the feeding that are training that data. So that's one example. along the history of IBM, many of the things that we've done, because they're so new, have this sort of flip side of being incredibly exciting and powerful. They can start Social Security, they can help to put a man on the moon, they can help to cure cancer. But at the same time, there's pieces of it that people worry about. And so we really see our engagement and our responsibility on both sides of that equation.
Great, thank you. And then I now turn to Keith, and in terms of Amalgamated, Keith and Amalgamated don't just talk the talk, they actually walk the walk in terms of corporate social responsibility. Their company is B Corp, I think it's technically B certified. So, you know, why did you, and I believe that was a decision that you made, why? And give us your view as a company that from top to bottom is focused on corporate social responsibility.
Thanks, Eric. It's not often that the head of a 94-year-old company is the youngest company on the panel. So that's a heartwarming thing. Eric, I think that what consumers and the public increasingly, they might not be our customers, but the public and the public perception of all of our companies now is looking for, to really pick up on, I think, Tim and Kathy's remarks both, is not just this sense of what we do philanthropically, but this sense of, is there an authenticity to what we talk about when we talk about corporate social responsibility? And there's increasingly a very, very narrow margin between what you say you're going to do and what in fact you actually do. And while the bank's customers admittedly lean to the left of the political spectrum and have a high level of expectation around certain issues, there is a real sense that when it comes to the issues that people look at when they become a B certified or a B corporation, is what are you doing on issues of workplace, environment, diversity, and governance and transparency. And they are looking for that authenticity to exist in the day-to-day behaviors of the corporation, and looking to make sure that what the corporation does in terms of those practices are consistent with what they're saying they hold other entities to be accountable to. And that is really hard because it is really easy to take that one little step off the cliff and be held accountable to one step when 99 of your 100 steps are exactly the right thing to do. It's that one little step that you might make a mistake on, say something inappropriately publicly, have an employment practice that's not quite consistent with the highest standards that the public is looking for that we need to do. The B corporation status for us was really an interesting thing. It's a self-assessment that looks at really those 4 areas and asks you to ultimately measure yourself, and you get that ability to have some third-party certification of your practices in that area to be able to say to the rest of the world, we've put ourselves up to a level of accountability, been judged by a third party, and get some level of a sense of assessment that you can say to the public, we've done this, and then be on a set of constant continual improvement in those areas. I think the other thing is then how do you actually take steps to make sure that you can protect your status as a company that does those things, and the B corporation status gives you an ability to write into your bylaws some ability to protect mission and to protect certain kinds of practices.
So you mentioned public perception, and yet when you think about a corporation, there's a myriad of stakeholders that have some influence. There's employees and there's investors and so on. So, you know, who or what is driving within the company this corporate social responsibility? And I'll start with you, Tim. When you're taking this outward appearance, what's, you know, is it the CEO? Is it the employee? Is it investors? Is it the consumer? Give us your perspective.
Well, I think it's all of those stakeholders, and we certainly pay attention to all of the stakeholders, but from my perspective, the most important stakeholder is the employee. And I have to say, I didn't always think that. When I was, you mentioned I was at AT&T. When I was at AT&T, I didn't really think the employees were the most important stakeholders. So my own thinking about that has grown over the years, but I really think that if you engage your employees in the community, and if they understand the importance of being socially responsible, which for the most part they do, then they're your ambassadors. Everything happens because of them. So, you know, from my perspective, particularly with millennials, we've heard a lot about millennials and, you know, what their interests are and what their priorities are. We have 55% of our workforce, which is millennials. By the year 2020, it's going to be 75% of our workforce, and so they rule. I mean, millennials are us, right? So I think you have to pay attention to what attracts millennials to your firm, what retains them, what engages them, what interests them, and they want a higher purpose in their jobs, and they want to work for a company that has a culture that is responsible and that engages them in their communities. And so from my perspective, employees are really what's driving our
Jen, is it the same at IBM? And can you also talk about a number of initiatives related to this? So for example, PTech, which is about skill building, is that for the community, for employees?
Right.
How do you look at it?
Yeah, so I think it's a blend. We've been lucky to have a series of CEOs who are all incredible advocates and drivers of this work. The employee piece, I agree, particularly with millennials, it's non-negotiable. We are competing for the hearts and minds of top millennial talent with our competitors, and we need to win that battle. So it's really important for us to be out front. One of the programs that we have actually is a program called Corporate Service Corps, which is a talent program. We have thousands of IBMers apply. If you win, we say congratulations. You are headed to Tanzania for 4 weeks to work on an environmental service project. Full pay, full benefits. You're going to be with a team of 12 other IBMers who will be working on this. And along the way, you're going to get skills. You're going to learn more about IBM. You're going to learn more about environmental issues. You'll learn more about Tanzania. And if you're like 95% of the people who have gone through the program, you will come home saying it was the best professional development experience of your life. So we have now sent over 4,000 IBMers through that, and the result of that is that when I go out and do recruiting, or we go out and talk to people, people will say, I don't even want to talk about pay and benefits. Tell me about the Corporate Service Corps. Well, how long do you have to be there to be a part of that? That's how big of a driver that is. You mentioned PTech, which is another amazing program that we're leading. This is really about developing workforce skills. So we partnered initially with Mike Bloomberg and City University of New York to build a 9 through 14 school in Brooklyn. So the basic thing is their college completion rates for associate's degrees, as I'm sure you all know, are incredibly low. There's just too many places where students drop out of the system. So the recipe for PTech was to say, combine high school with community college with an industry partner, develop a curriculum that actually positions students to get middle-class jobs at the end of 6 years, give them workplace experiences, make sure they have a mentor, make sure they get internships along the way, and then make sure companies are ready to hire them on the other side. That was the commitment we made in Brooklyn. That has then spread to Chicago, more in New York. Governor Cuomo has been hugely supportive. We're now in 6 states. It's also spread to Australia, Morocco. We have over 80 schools worldwide and growing. So that is, I think, about the future workforce more than the current.
So, Kathy, is this a change in terms of when you think about sort of the raw definition of a company, which is a for-profit making institution, that everything is done for the benefit of the investors? Is this a new way that corporations are starting to think, where is the investor not first and foremost, or is this, doing good while doing good business?
Well, I think what we ought to acknowledge is the tension between the pressure, the business pressures, the shareholder pressures, and community and employee priorities. And that is very real, and it's probably one of the most destructive things in American business over the last 4 decades, has been the rise of short-term thinking about quarterly reports and profit margins, and how shareholder activists and private equity have stimulated a move away from the priority being on employee and community and toward the priority being on short-term thinking, bottom line, and against long-term investment in the corporation. Now, there are also tax laws that drive that. It's not just shareholder activism. The inability to bring earnings back from overseas on a practical basis for companies have diminished the investment potential. So there are a lot of factors, but you've got to see, when you're talking about the corporate responsibility issue, there's a real tension. There is an understanding, both historic and politically current, on the part of corporate leadership that they have got to demonstrate commitment to employees, just to attract people, as Jen was saying, and commitment to their community. But there's also these countervailing pressures, and I think there's too little understanding in the press and elsewhere as to how these pressures work against each other, and I think it's something that this organization should understand and could be helpful in communicating those tensions, because it's a real conundrum for the leaders of business organizations.
Keith, do you feel the same tension with your company in dealing with your investors? Did the move to be certified change that discussion or alter that tension?
Let me first answer the question about who the most important stakeholder is, and then I'll come back to that, because I actually think, thanks, I appreciate that very much. I think that the most important stakeholder, while I agree with both Jen and Tim, but I think it really has to start at the top. And I think unless the board and the senior leadership of the company and the CEO of the company embrace this, the way to engage all the rest of the shareholders is really diminished, because it is that top leadership that has to define why this is important for the investor community and why this makes good business sense and make that business case. It is that top leadership that has to send that signal through the entire corporation that we're doing this and that we're a better company because of it and we're more holistic, and has to be that intermediary with the customers and the press and the public to talk about the way that the company does this. So I actually think that you've got to have top leadership buy-in, or it's very, very difficult to actually make this part of your corporate culture. Like with so many other things, it's not unique. Yeah. In terms of that investor, pressure, that's what we have been able to do. Is we've been able to say that as a bank that has decided to very explicitly curate the relationship with a very, very specific customer base. Our customer base is very, very clearly aligned with our historic base in unions, other advocacy groups, the Democratic Party, and the members of those organizations. We are a little bit fortunate in the sense that we can get out there a little bit more on some of the spectrum and do this and make the argument internally that it really makes good business sense and is part of our business plan to do that. So we're a little fortunate in that sense. We're also private, so we don't have some of the same pressures, although they're very real. I mean, the short-term pressure from a quarterly basis, regardless if you're public or private, is still very real. Kathy's points are absolutely spot on. Public, private, that pressure from your investors, in the case of a banking entity, from our regulators to be able to demonstrate regular earnings progress is very real. And sometimes these two things can be in tension, and you have to be able to justify why the corporate social responsibility programs makes good business sense from a business plan perspective.
Could I just respond to something Keith said? So I don't disagree that it's important to have your CEO and your board, responsive and supportive of what you do. But I do think that there are a lot of things that can happen at the grassroots level with employees, which bring issues to the attention of the top leadership of the company. And in our own case at American Express, we're not. We're a financial services company, so we're not a polluter. Yes, we do have a carbon, footprint, and we do use a lot of paper, but we're not an extractor, we're not a manufacturer. And so environmental sustainability is not top of mind for our leaders, but it is for our employees. And we, after sort of beating our head against the wall for a few years to get more attention paid to the issue of environmental responsibility, we created a movement with our employees inside our company, a green team, we call it Green Together. And that group of employees has really driven a lot of change inside the company within their business units and staff groups, which then engages their leaders, who engage their leaders, and it finally sort of gets to the top. And now we have much more buy-in for issues related to climate change and environmental responsibility, but it really started with our employees, so it doesn't always have to be a top-down kind of thing, but you do need their support.
The same was true. It was the affinity groups within corporations that, for example, marriage equality CEOs never would have been willing to go public and file amicus briefs on that if it hadn't been the pressure from the affinity groups of their employees that said this is a priority issue and you have to go public on this.
But one of the things about any of these programs related to corporate social responsibility is that at the heart, they're still voluntary. In this country, you decide as a CEO of a company whether or not you want to do it, whether or not it's in your self-interest, whether or not it extends your brand. But that is different than what's happening in other parts of the world where it's actually regulated. And so, Jen, can you give us a sense of maybe the tension in the organization where an international company is facing some areas that are regulated? Is that impacting what's happening at home? You know, give us a sense, and also how you manage in different parts of the world.
Sure. So our general goal is to exceed the standards or regulations of all the countries that we do business in. So if that's your goal, then you're in pretty good shape, right? And to really focus on walking the talk and doing it. So of course we file GRI, we file all of the standard environmental, supply chain, governance, regulatory reports in the countries where those things are required. But it's really our mission to make sure that we are following that same standard of behavior in the other places.
Right. Tim, what have you?
Yeah, I would say the same thing. We have the same expectation that we will, you know, at least meet, if not exceed, all of the regulations and expectations of our stakeholders. And so, yes, there are some places in the world where one needs to report on certain kinds of activity, or in India where one needs to, you know, give 2% of your pre-tax net income to charitable causes. But we meet or exceed those rules and those expectations. So that's our goal. Really, we want to be a responsible company. We want to be viewed and respected as a responsible company. And so you can't just, you know, follow the rules. If you're going to do that, everybody has to follow the rules, right? That's just the price of admission. So what are you doing over and above that?
Right. So, Kat, I mean, you know, in today's environment, I think that the sense is that there'll be very little regulatory, and I doubt anyway that this would be an area that would become regulated. But when you're talking to CEOs, give us a sense of how they think about this. I mean, it starts from the top. In terms of the corporate social responsibility, are they, as you said before, are they looking to fill a void? Are they doing it in some ways to make a political statement? Is it really about sort of the business, you know, promoting strong, you know, family leave and maternity is important, but it's also good to ensure that you've got equality in the workplace and are recruiting, you know, talented women.
Well, I think I was going to say in response to your earlier question, and it relates to this, that this is a communication I try and have with the New York City Council, often to no avail, which is that the corporate interests and the culture in this country really is a voluntary one, that there is a lot going on with particularly New York-based employers who are out there competing for employees, for talent, in lots of ways. And the mandates actually become a negative distraction to those companies. And it creates an atmosphere in New York City where, and state, that these are bad actors, when in fact, much is going on inside every company that typically exceeds the requirements of the mandates, and is in fact, what we have a problem with, I think, is transparency, and not necessarily hiding things, but communicating effectively things, and the attention span of the press and the media and others, which doesn't focus on the good things that are happening, it focuses on the exceptional bad things that are happening. And that creates an atmosphere that's really negative in terms of building and supporting a culture which in this country and in this city in particular, as I started by saying, has been terrific from a business culture standpoint, with exceptions always, and those have to be dealt with. But I think that tension, it's really important to begin to figure out more effectively how to communicate that, how to engage more of our elected officials, and help them understand what's really going on. And that's what we're thinking about a lot these days, is how do we communicate what's really happening in these companies, what the real tensions are, like with the short-termism and the shareholder activism, And how can the community support employers who are trying to do the right thing in a positive way, rather than work for ways to assert that they've mandated the most progressive whatever in the country for all employers?
You raise a really interesting point, Kathy, and that is, and you can tell just by, or with the people that we have on this panel, companies are doing really remarkable things to push corporate social responsibility programs. But yet, and maybe I'm mistaken, and I'd like to hear certainly from the companies, there seems to be a reluctance on the part of the companies to market or advertise what you're actually doing. So, that is sort of a vicious cycle that then leads to the public thinking that companies are, to use Kathy's term, bad actors, when in fact they're quite the opposite. So, can you address, that tension?
Sure. So I agree. As I've moved into this role just a couple months ago and visited with people, both IBMers and outsiders have said the number one thing is we're still the best kept secret at IBM, and that not enough people know about all the great work. So do you advertise it? We made a choice a long time ago not to do that. We felt like it was too patting ourselves on the back, and that the best way to share the story was through the voice of the IBMer. So, we're close to 400,000 people around the world. At least over half of them are actively volunteering in their communities. How much work does that do? How much work can we do through social and through earned? And I think what we're finding is it may be time to dial it up a little bit, because there is so much noise, as you're describing, and there's so much volume to the negative stories.
And Keith, in your case, your corporate social responsibility is your brand. When you talk about the company, you by definition are talking about it. So you have a different view that you're really all about communicating this?
It is. We do it every day. Again, I think it's somewhat related to the fact that we have a unique niche. I don't relish the position that a lot of CEOs have who are trying to recruit business from across a broad spectrum of viewpoints, and I think it's always been dangerous for many CEOs to take political positions, for instance, or to tout things too much that it might offend people who may not share a same value set, and things like that. Marriage equality, a good example. You never hear corporate CEOs, or very rarely, get out there on issues of choice or gun control or those kinds of very controversial issues, oftentimes not wanting to do it. But there is this increasing pressure now, I think, for corporate leaders to take political positions in what's become a very, very, very hostile sort of environment on a lot of these issues. And that expectation is, I think, what's really changing. It's different than touting the work that we do. There seems to be a burgeoning expectation that if Jamie Dimon or Tim Cook or people who have become increasingly household names aren't speaking about the issues of the day, that's becoming a reflection on the corporation themselves. It's going to be interesting to see how that evolves.
Eric, if you will, I just wanted to raise with Keith. He's kind of got the opposite problem of the corporations, which he's got the danger that he has a business problem, as you alluded to before. And I just would relate that the question of his investors and regulators is, do you have your eye on the right ball?
Right.
On a business standpoint. If anybody who recently watched what happened since Etsy went public with one of my favorite companies in the world, Etsy, but their CEO was recently ousted and their board is undergoing a revolution. They're a B Corp, a public B Corp, and the accusation is too much attention to the B principles and not enough attention to the business. How can you deal with that situation?
Yeah, I think it's an important tension that we have to be able to deal with. Increasingly, our customers expect us to be very good on all of the issues of the day, and we, by virtue, have to put some time and attention into that. But the reality is, we're a much smaller company than my colleagues here on the panel. We're 420 people strong, and probably 418 of those people are involved in the day-to-day business operations that we need to do, and a very small sliver really involved in thinking about the kind of B principles, if you will. What's been important, though, is I think, how do we take that down and try and think about, in the business that we do, how are we making sure that we live those principles in the delivery of the services that we provide. and do that on an everyday basis. The development of products that are really speaking to trying to think about incorporating these principles into, yes, our profit-generating goods that we offer, right? How do we do that in a way that's consistent with those principles? That's one of the challenges that we face every day.
I want to come back to this, to Tim with the same question. Again, on the tension of sort of the internal focus versus the external communication. In your case, as you talked about, the employee, i.e. sort of internally focused, is the #1 priority. And so does American Express care about externally marketing what it's doing and sort of having that part of its brand?
I'd say that we care very much about communicating what we do. I'm not sure about marketing what we do, but communicating is incredibly important to us because it's important to our employees, quite honestly, and it's important to our customers. And so we do use vehicles like social media to communicate about the good work that we're doing in communities. We use our employees as ambassadors. We work with our nonprofit partners to communicate what we're doing together to address certain issues and causes. So I think we do a lot to communicate what we do. We're not particularly interested in advertising that good work, but it kind of depends on what you think the it is. Because if corporate social responsibility is really about how companies operate, we are a service company. We are incredibly committed to servicing our customers. We talk about it every day. It's the mantra that all of our employees, learn. Service is noble, a noble calling. And so we communicate that a lot. We market that a lot. We think that's a differentiator for us in a very competitive environment. And so we do market the fact that we're a service company and that we're really committed to service, and I think that's part of our corporate social responsibility. It's not something that I manage as part of our CSR programs. It's not, volunteering in communities, but it's a very, short leap from servicing our customers to servicing communities. It's all sort of one and the same. So I think it depends on, how you want to communicate what you do as a company.
But what about Small Business Saturday?
Yeah, Small Business Saturday was really about engaging small businesses. It was
pretty effective marketing.
It was, except that we very much wanted Small Business Saturday to be about a movement that involved a variety of companies, and it wasn't just about using your American Express card to support small businesses in your community, on the Saturday after Thanksgiving, because we didn't care whether you used our competitors' cards or cash or whatever you did to get out there and support small businesses. Did we benefit from that? Yes.
But I think your distinction is such a good one between marketing and communication, because we do know that when the ads get too glossy and we're doing a victory lap, it loses all authenticity. And we've all walked through airports with companies, boasting about things that seem very separate from their value proposition or what their core business model is, and they're just not credible. So I think that communicating or being very focused on an issue like a Small Business Saturday that's really driving a specific action and engaging people is a different kind of choice. So I think the communicating piece, that's a good distinction.
So I have another round of questions, but I just want to turn the level of responsibility over to the audience. So I am letting you know that you're responsible for getting some really good questions to me. There's some really challenging ones that I've not asked, so I'm expecting them to come from the audience.
Here they come.
There we go. But the last question I'm going to ask the panel is, we talked about the idea that at the end, companies still are about for profit. Kathy talked about the Etsy example that you can focus on, the social good, but the business still needs to work. How do you know what you're doing is succeeding? How do you target, account for the outcome of your products and your programs? I'll start with you.
Sure. So obviously this is fairly complex and it varies by program. There are both external barometers that we use as well as internal. We always think it's important to ask third parties to come in and evaluate our work in terms of its social impact. So we might work with business schools, we might work with nonprofits or think tanks to come in and do that work. We're very excited. Yale School of Management just did a case study on Corporate Service Corps, really focused on the social impact that was very helpful to us. Internally, we look at metrics. Is it driving employee engagement? Is it helping retention? Is it helping with leadership development? And then really thinking about, from getting our messaging out there, one of the other things that's important to us is back to that point of innovation, right? Are we taking our latest and greatest technologies and using them to do something nobody thought could be done? And so I think that's another important KPI.
Yeah, I think it's actually a really simple thing. What do you hear from your customers and your employees? And literally, why do they tell you why they like working at your thing, at your workplace, and why it makes a difference? Why do they think about doing business with you? It's a completely unsatisfactory thing when somebody says to me, wow, you have the best checking account in the world, right? I mean, it's like, great. It's so much more enticing when people say, I do business with you because of the things that you do. And I'm fortunate enough to hear that enough. The opposite is actually also quite true. You know you're not doing well when you hear the complaints, and not the nettlesome kind of complaints, the real legitimate complaints from people who you really value and trust and what they're saying.
Tim?
So the primary business objective of our CEO and senior leaders is to be the world's most respected service brand. And that has the benefit of being measurable. Okay, we can measure that. It depends on what you want to use as your measure, but we happen to use the Fortune Most Admired list. So we also use other external metrics and internal metrics, but that's a place where we really look. So we'd love to be number one, but we definitely want to be in the top 10 there. And so we pay attention to that. And one of the ingredients, if you will, in that Fortune Most Admired list is your CSR efforts. And so we want to be number one on that CSR list in our industry, which we are. So we're not number one as the most admired company, but we're number one in a CSR ingredient. And so we pay attention to that, and we use that as a measure. And it has certain flaws attached to it, but you have to pick something, and that's the thing that we've picked, the measure we've picked.
So while paying 100% to what you've been saying, but relying on the skills of millennial, I've been multitasking and looking at these questions at the same time. So there seems to be a theme in some of these questions, which really goes to, it goes to purpose and vision and mission, which we started off the panel talking about. And I'll address this to Tim because this is where most of them are gone, but we'll expand it beyond it. And the question is, would you be able to drill down a little bit into the purpose concept? How does this differ from visioning or mission? And related to that for other panel members is, are you hearing, and we talked a little bit about it, so bottoms up, that the employees are really demanding this, particularly in the current climate, and how does that purpose differ among your organizations? So Tim, you want to take a stab first?
Well, how does it differ from mission and vision? I don't think it does, really. It's just the new word that people are using to talk about those things. Being purpose-driven, I think it's very similar to being mission-driven as an organization. So I'm not sure that's different, but yeah, we're hearing that from our employees. They want a greater purpose. They don't want the purpose to be to make money for our shareholders or to increase our profit that year from a P&L perspective. So yes, I think they do want to work at a company that has a bigger, broader culture and purpose. And for us, again, it's being a service company. It's differentiating our products and services, based on the service mentality. And you kind of have to buy into that. If you want to work for American Express, you better be interested in service and in providing service in all of its various aspects, because that's who we are and what we do. So, is service our purpose? Yes, service is our purpose. As I said, our CEO wants, to be the world's most respected service brand. And so, people, that's how we attract people to the company, that's how we retain people to the company, and that's how we measure our performance.
So I agree with many of your comments. I think that employees are demanding it, and they feel lit up when they feel it, right? So one of the problems of being a company of almost 400,000 people is that you get layers between what some people are working on and the client, right? So maybe you're stuck in a lab, maybe you're stuck in a cubicle or an office, and you're working on something meaningful, but you can't see it happening in the real world. So I think one of the things that we can do in citizenship is to help to narrow that gap. So for example, we have a Health Corps project where one of my colleagues who works with Memorial Sloan Kettering on Watson and artificial intelligence for cancer diagnosis, but he's worked in a lab writing code for 5 years, like really long time. We put him on a team to go out and work on how do we bring some of those technologies to sub-Saharan Africa. And he had a chance to actually visit with ministers of health to see people who are going through cancer treatment and to really very firsthand get reconnected to why am I doing this? And he said it was completely re-energizing for him, and plus he learned a lot that he then brought back to the other piece of work. So I think that's the purpose element and just keeping that fire going for people.
Kathy, do you hear or feel that CEOs are changing the way they're talking about their companies and thinking more and talking more purpose, mission, or they're still focused on, they've got their stakeholders and investors and they're just plodding away in terms of building their business?
They're torn, is what it amounts to. One time, CEO used to be a lifetime job or a longer-term job than it is today. They feel constant pressure, and they really are torn. So I think I raised the issues because I think there is a real conflict out there. I'm reminded by this last conversation as we talk about the employee-driven model and the opportunities for employees of companies that are really buying into the purpose-driven mission, that a third of the folks out there in New York City now are not working for a company, they're self-employed. And how are we thinking about independent contractors and supply chain relationships would be kind of the next question. We get that on MWBE inquiries, for example, that's going to be coming up. But I think that's an important, I think there's going to be increasing political pressure on the corporate business community to address that issue.
Yeah, I think that's what's driving the conversation to the extent that there's something driving it, which is the pressure increasingly to have a CSR program or to take a particular position on some things. When CEOs get together, this is not the #1 thing that they talk about. Unless they are sort of faced with some negative publicity or some negative public pressure, the conversation will tend to shift towards basic business principles and regulation, taxes, politics, some other things, but not very often, sort of speaking truth here, not very often to what their programs are within their corporations.
So another variation of a question that I see has been submitted multiple times is the idea of companies working with nonprofits versus creating your own program. So how do you view companies working with separate nonprofits or just creating their own programs?
Yeah, I think for anything really significant on the planet to be accomplished, it has to be done in partnership, period. So, we can start ideas, but there's nothing that we do that we aren't in partnership either with NGOs, with government, with other companies. We have many of our projects, like P-TECH, we have 300 business partners, so partnership's just a requirement.
The whole mission of the Amalgamated Bank is to help those who do good do better, and a lot of our work is about taking the friction out to really celebrate the work of our customers much more than the work that we do every day. We can't be there on all those things. We have a unique business model. I recognize that, but ours, I agree with Jen wholeheartedly. It's all about working in conjunction with other organizations that spend every living moment of their day trying to think about accomplishing their own missions, which are oftentimes not the same as ours as companies.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Everything that we do in partnership, primarily with NGOs and nonprofits. But that doesn't mean, for those of you from the nonprofit community here, it doesn't mean that we can partner with every nonprofit organization or on every cause. So, there are different levels of partnership. Some people think some nonprofits, even companies, think partnership means we give you money and you do something. That's not really a partnership. A partnership is when we co-create a program and we co-manage the program and we are jointly responsible for the results. That's a real partnership, but we can only do so many of those. We have maybe 5 or 6 of those kinds of partnerships that are really global partnerships in nature, and they're incredibly labor intensive, and most of us are very short staff. We have very small staffs. I have 10 people on my staff managing global programs, so you can only do so many of those. So we would love to partner with every organization, but we can't.
We've got a few minutes left in this panel, and I want each of the panelists to answer that question that I posed at the beginning, that 5-letter word with T, called trust. And in general, we've seen, or we're living in an environment where, not to be melodramatic, but many of our institutions are being attacked, whether they're college institutions, whether they're corporations, whether they're media institutions, government institutions, and that has a real profound effect on how consumers and citizens are working with companies. And so maybe just sort of go down the line and talk a little bit about trust today. About, and I know it's a complex topic, but sort of the highlights of how you view what's going on. Start with Keith and come down.
So let's go back all the way to 2008 when the financial crisis happened, and in our industry, banking in particular, every component of trust was taken away from the industry. Nobody trusted bankers, and it's lingered for an incredibly long time. We did a poll of our customers last year. We were ranked below members of Congress as people did. No, it's true. As people that
that would be last.
That would be I think prison convicts might have been lower, but we didn't ask about those. Dead last, and it's really important, I think, for corporate leaders to figure out how to win back that trust, and it means you have to. I said the word about authenticity. I mean, you really do have to be authentic at the beginning. You can't talk one thing and then do something different, because that won't last in this environment anymore. That's exactly what this environment has created, is people wanting to get that gotcha moment and find that. So you've got to figure out how your companies believe what you're saying, believe what you're doing, and think that you're going to carry through on that, which in many instances means I think you have to choose your sort of battles very wisely here. You've got to make sure that what you're saying you're going to do is something you can actually deliver on.
Okay.
Well, I think there is still a reticence, as there was after the financial crisis. I tried to get the New York-based financial institutions to work together on a public education program, and to get competing companies, global corporations, to sublimate their own corporate brand and combine with brands that they may not trust. Or that they're competing against, is very difficult. So it is hard to scale a public education campaign across an industry or across corporate America. And I think, to me, that's a big challenge. There are a couple efforts going on now. There's one that's going to be announced next week that's going to focus on issues of diversity and pay equity within the workplace. That's going to be pan-industry. The efforts within education that IBM has worked on has been, as Jen mentioned, 300 corporations working together. But it's very hard to get companies to do that when they're making an investment in a program. They want credit for it. They want credit with the politicians for it. They want to run their own political fundraisers. It's a tough thing to do, but I think that's what's necessary, because the negatives against the corporation, like Congress, you may like one company that you know and trust, but corporate America in general, there's a great antipathy toward, and I think we've just got to figure out a way to deal with that more collectively.
Yeah, I think that's right. I was thinking that this issue of mistrust, is perpetuated by the media. It's perpetuated by government officials, and we love all those people. But there is a sort of sense out there that corporations are bad actors, and all it takes is one incident of somebody being dragged off a plane. And all of a sudden, all corporations are sort of lumped together as bad actors. I think from our perspective, our customers trust us. they wouldn't be customers otherwise. So they trust us with their data, they trust us with their financial information, they trust us to complete transactions. You know, we have over 100 million households just here in the United States of people who really, you know, trust us. Otherwise, they'd go someplace else. So I think we do a lot to try to build trust with our customers and with our potential customers, and we want to be viewed as a trustworthy company, and we wish that the atmosphere around corporations in general was perhaps more positive. But you know, I've seen glimmers of hope there. You know, after our president pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords, I was shocked that the New York Times ran a whole piece that was just tweets from corporate CEOs and their response. And of all of those tweets, you know, 98% of them were supportive of the Paris Agreement and not supportive of the president. And I think there were 2 that were supportive of the president. And that was really surprising, I think, for the New York Times, you know, to do that. So, you know, I think there's, you know, even Jimmy Kimmel the other night said a joke that corporations have figured out if they don't have customers, that's bad for their business. You know, and that's true, right? It's funny, but it's really, really true. So I think there's hope.
So we're fortunate, right? If you look at Edelman Trust Barometer, while CEOs and businesses in general are down in the 20s and 30s, IT industry is in the 70s. And so there's a halo around the IT industry as a whole. I think a lot of that is earned, and we have to be very careful with it. It's very fragile, so it's something we take seriously. At IBM, obviously, we're asking our clients to trust us with health data, financial data. We work with defense systems. There's no choice. We have to be trusted. And so personal trust and responsibility in every relationship is actually the first of 3 values that IBMers came together and created, you know, as a group. So that's an employee piece. The other piece on your point about working together, we actually have partnered with some of our fiercest competitors on this artificial intelligence thing, because we're all agreed that we as a group have to come up with a shared set of ethics and responsibility around AI and its purpose and where we're going with that to continue to earn the kind of trust that we have today. So that's being very proactive about it.
Great. Well, I think we've had a pretty wide and diverse conversation. What I want to just do is raise some of the other areas of questions that have come up to make sure that in other discussions, we obviously on one panel we can't address everything, but the remaining questions seem to be in four different buckets. You know, one, a real interest and concern about how the current administration is affecting corporate social responsibility and what is the difference between political versus social responsibility. So that was an interesting question. The second area focused on the difference between corporate social responsibility and philanthropy, and how companies, I think we addressed that as well, and how that is changing. The third area of questioning or questions dealt with, and we did talk about employees, but the importance of creating an innovative and diverse workforce and workplace where you are getting ideas from everybody. This notion that as a company you're creating an environment where you allow for bottom to top ideas and generating an environment where people feel like they can raise issues of importance to other employees. And then the last area of questions focused on the idea that if companies take on a bigger and bigger role, what does this mean for the role of the small nonprofit, and will that nonprofit survive? And I think in that question, I think as Jen talked about, in many cases, the work that large companies do are partnerships that rely on nonprofits, and that's not the sole means by which nonprofits will grow, but again, it goes to the purpose and the mission of what those nonprofits are. So a bunch of great questions. Time constraints prevent us from answering all of them, but let's just have a round of applause for the panelists.
Thank you, Eric. That was wonderful, and our panel. So we've gone from navigating engagement with various stakeholders to really hearing how this is taking place on the ground level in a number of companies, which the BBB is really very fortunate to engage with. So thank you on that. And in terms of BBB and trust, everything does spring from trust and transparency. And I think, Jen, you mentioned the role of ethics in all of this that we've talked about. And of course, you look at standards to help you do that. So we're taking a 15-minute break. And when we come back, more on the subject of engagement. Thank you.